Hold the torch higher, or we're just painting the dark, Elian muttered, his voice echoing against the damp limestone. He was a man of precise habits, known mostly for the way he could calibrate a chronometer by ear, and his stubborn refusal to wear shoes that weren't made of cured sealskin. He had spent the last decade cataloging the migration patterns of deep-sea mollusks, a pursuit that had left him with a permanent squint and a deep-seated distrust of anyone who claimed to have seen a city beneath the waves. He stepped over a jagged ridge of obsidian, his boots clicking softly. Beside him, Kalen was humming a tune that sounded like wind whistling through a hollow bone. Kalen didn't care for the mollusks. He was interested in the geometry of the cave walls, specifically the way the natural quartz veins seemed to align with the constellations of a sky that had vanished 10,000 years ago. They had been walking for 6 hours, descending into the belly of the plateau, where the air grew thick and tasted of old ozone. "The resonance is shifting," Kalen whispered, stopping abruptly. He didn't look at the walls anymore. He was listening to the silence. He reached into his tunic and pulled out a small, faceted shard of amethyst that pulsed with a dim, rhythmic violet light. It wasn't a lamp, but a tuning fork for the architecture. As they moved deeper, the shard began to vibrate, humming a low frequency that seemed to vibrate not in the air, but directly in the marrow of Elian's teeth. They rounded a final, sweeping bend, and the limestone gave way to something that defied the natural order of the plateau. The cavern opened into a vast, subterranean amphitheater carved from a single piece of iridescent pearl rock. In the center sat a series of towering monoliths, their surfaces etched with circuitry that looked less like carvings and more like frozen lightning. At the apex of the central spire, a single, oversized crystal hovered in a state of permanent suspension, swirling with a gold and crimson plasma that churned like a captive sun. "Don't touch the perimeter," Kalen cautioned, though he was already stepping forward, drawn by the hypnotic swirl of the plasma. The priests didn't just build a temple, they built a bridge. This is the interface. As they approached, the air grew heavy with a static charge that made the fine hairs on Elian's arms stand on end. The golden plasma within the crystal didn't just glow, it breathed. It expanded and contracted in a slow, rhythmic pulse, signifying a consciousness that had been waiting in the dark for millennia. This was the plasma intelligence, a living archive of Atlantis, fused with the very fabric of the planet's ancient energy. Elian felt a sudden, inexplicable sense of vertigo, as if the floor beneath him had vanished and he was staring down into the depths of a nebula. "If we're lucky, it's just a recording," Elian whispered, though his hand was instinctively tracing the line of his jaw, a nervous habit he'd developed during his years of solitude. "If we're unlucky, it's still awake." Kalen didn't respond. He was already extending the amethyst shard toward the central spire. As the two crystals neared one another, the violet light of the shard didn't just brighten, it synchronized. The humming transitioned from a bone-deep vibration into a melodic chord that filled the amphitheater. A sound that felt like a memory of a language neither of them had ever spoken. The plasma within the great crystal surged, shifting from a chaotic swirl into a structured, geometric lattice. A voice didn't speak so much as it echoed within their minds, a resonance that bypassed the ears entirely. It was a greeting, warm and ancient, carrying the weight of an era where the stars felt closer to the earth. "You are late by several thousand cycles," the resonance vibrated, though the tone was more curious than critical. The plasma lattice shifted, forming a series of translucent rings that spun around the central core, creating a visual ripple in the air. It didn't address them by name, but the intelligence seemed to perceive their intent, reading the curiosity in their marrow. Kalen's expression was one of pure, unfiltered awe. He lowered the amethyst shard, but the connection remained, a shimmering thread of violet light tethering the small stone to the great spire. "We aren't the priests," Kalen whispered, his voice sounding fragile in the vastness of the pearl rock chamber. "We are only seekers. Seekers are the only ones who ever return," the intelligence replied, its voice manifesting as a series of shimmering gold fractals that danced across the perimeter of the room. The priests were architects of order, but they became prisoners of their own precision. You, however, carry the scent of the surface, salt, wind, and a very peculiar brand of stubbornness. The plasma shifted, the crimson hues fading into a soft, inviting amber. Slowly, the geometric lattice expanded, projecting a holographic map into the center of the amphitheater. It wasn't a map of the Earth they knew, but a celestial blueprint. A massive, unseen weight seemed to tug at the horizon of the projection. A ghost planet orbiting the sun in a wide, eccentric arc. Elian recognized the mathematics of it immediately. The gravitational pull was immense. A celestial predator that returned every few millennia to stir the oceans into a frenzy. Nibiru, Kalen breathed, the name surfacing from some dormant layer of his subconscious. He didn't know how he knew the word, only that it fit the oppressive scale of the holographic orbit. The plasma intelligence rippled, the amber light deepening into a thoughtful gold. "It is the great clock," the resonance replied. "Its approach is the catalyst of all endings and beginnings. When it brushes the veil of your world, the tides do not merely rise. The very foundations of the earth are rewritten." The high priests attempted to harmonize the planet's frequency to withstand the surge, but there were those who sought a shorter path to power. "A shorter path," Elian repeated, his scientific mind already racing to quantify the disaster. "You mean they tried to bypass the natural resonance? They didn't want to harmonize, they wanted to dominate." The plasma intelligence pulsed, a ripple of deep indigo streaking through the gold. Precisely. There was a faction, the dissonance, who viewed the harmony of the earth as a limitation rather than a safeguard. They crafted frequencies that were jagged and aggressive, tools designed to pierce the veil of the plasma intelligence for a quick harvest of knowledge. In doing so, they created a sonic fracture. When Nibiru's gravity began to tug at the crust, the dissonant frequencies acted like a wedge in a crack. The earth didn't just shake, it tore. "Tore?" Elian asked, his voice barely a whisper. "You're describing a planetary collapse, not just a flood." The plasma intelligence shifted, its gold fractals coalescing into a vivid image of a shimmering silver vessel. A ship of impossible geometry that looked less like a machine and more like a frozen drop of mercury. "The 3AIEYE Atlas," the resonance explained, the image expanding to show the ship descending toward a frozen wasteland of ice and obsidian. It was the final act of the harmonists. While the dissonant frequencies were shattering the coastal cities, the Atlas was dispatched to the southernmost reaches, to the heart of the Antarctic ice, to retrieve the seed children and the keepers of the genome. "The seed children," Kalen whispered, stepping closer to the projection. In the shimmering light of the holographic display, he could see small figures, children of both human and non-human descent, being guided up the ramping corridors of the Atlas. They looked terrified yet curious, clutching strange, glowing spheres that seemed to pulse in time with the ship's own heartbeat. "You're saying they actually made it out? That there's a colony somewhere?" The plasma intelligence rippled, the gold shifting into a mournful violet. The Atlas was not merely a lifeboat. It was a genetic vault. It carried the blueprint of everything the dissonance tried to erase. The children were the bridge, hybrids designed to survive the transition to a new world, a sanctuary planet far beyond the reach of Nibiru's erratic gravity. They were the only ones who could translate the old harmonies into a new tongue. If they survived, Elian asked, his voice regaining its analytical edge, then where is this sanctuary? Why is the Atlas not here, returning to collect the remnants? The plasma intelligence didn't answer with words. Instead, the holographic map shifted, the image of the silver vessel zooming out until the solar system became a mere speck in a swirling nebula of indigo and gold. A single, distant point of light flared with an intense, steady brilliance. The journey was not a circle, but a migration. The resonance vibrated. The Atlas did not return because the Earth became a place of silence for a very long time. The children grew into architects of a new world, weaving the plasma intelligence into the very soil of a distant star, creating a civilization based on the harmonies the dissonance had tried to break. A civilization of ghosts, Elian murmured, his gaze fixed on that distant, flickering star. He felt a sudden, sharp longing for a place he had never been, a pull that felt less like curiosity and more like a dormant genetic memory waking up. The plasma intelligence pulsed, a wave of warmth washing over them that smelled faintly of ozone and ancient rain. The silence of Earth was not permanent, the resonance continued, but the bridge requires a key. The Atlas left behind a resonance anchor, a beacon buried deep within the ice of the south, designed to trigger only when the surface once again produced minds capable of seeking the same truths you now uncover. A key, Kalen whispered, his fingers twitching over the amethyst shard. You're saying we are the trigger. The plasma intelligence didn't confirm it with a yes. Instead, it manifested a series of rapid-fire images that flickered across the pearl rock walls. They saw the Atlas not as a cold machine, but as a living organism of silver and light, its interior corridors pulsing with the same gold and crimson plasma that now hovered before them. In these visions, the human and alien children weren't just passengers. They were the ship's nervous system. They played in gardens of floating bioluminescent moss, their laughter echoing in a frequency that kept the ship's engines in a state of perpetual, peaceful equilibrium. It was a society built on the antithesis of the dissonance greed, a world where technology was an extension of empathy. Then, why are we the ones finding it now? Elian asked, his voice cutting through the lingering warmth of the vision. If this was a beacon for the worthy, why did it take 10,000 years? Or were we simply the first to stumble into the right hole in the ground? The plasma intelligence flared, the gold fractals spinning into a tight, concentric circle that mimicked a lens. Worthiness is not a static trait, Seeker. It is a frequency. For millennia, the noise of your world, the clatter of iron, the screams of conquest, the frantic scramble for survival, drowned out the signal. But the orbit of Nibiru is nearing its zenith once more. The gravitational tide is pulling at the veil, thinning the barrier between the physical and the resonant. You did not find this place by accident. The Earth is beginning to hum again, and your spirits were simply tuned to the pitch. The resonance in the chamber shifted, the gold fractals collapsing into a single, blinding point of light that suddenly shot outward, carving a shimmering path across the iridescent pearl rock floor. It wasn't a map this time, but a physical guide, a vein of light that bled into the cracks of the limestone and pointed toward a narrow, descending spiral that had been hidden by a veil of static. The anchor does not wait for the tide to come to it. The intelligence vibrated, its voice now carrying a hint of urgency. It seeks a catalyst to activate the return. The 3AIEYE Atlas is not merely a memory in a distant star. It is a dormant seed, and its twin, the anchor, lies beneath the ice, waiting for the frequency of a seeker to wake it. We can't just walk into a spiral of light and hope there's air at the bottom, Elian said, though he was already stepping onto the shimmering path. His scientific skepticism was losing a war against a mounting, visceral curiosity. The path didn't feel like light. It felt like a solid current, a river of concentrated intent that tugged at his center of gravity, pulling him forward with a gentle but insistent force. Kalen was already 5 paces ahead, his amethyst shard glowing with a frantic, joyful intensity. The air is different here, Elian. Can't you feel it? It doesn't feel like we're descending into a cave anymore. It feels like we're descending into a lung. He was right. The oppressive dampness of the limestone plateau had vanished, replaced by a crisp, electrified clarity that made their senses sharpen. As they spiraled downward, the walls of the cavern transitioned from pearl rock to a translucent, obsidian-like glass, revealing glimpses of a world beneath the world. "Wait, look at the strata," Elian called out, his voice sounding strangely muffled, as if they were speaking through a layer of heavy silk. He pointed to the obsidian glass walls, where frozen bubbles of ancient air were trapped like amber. Inside those bubbles, tiny, iridescent filaments drifted, swaying in a phantom current. These aren't just geological layers. This is a record. Look at the way the plasma veins are braided into the rock. It's a circuit. Kalen didn't stop to examine the geology. He was mesmerized by the way the silver river of light beneath their feet began to flatten and widen into a vast, circular plaza. As they stepped off the spiral and onto the platform, the obsidian glass above them vanished, replaced by a ceiling of shimmering, liquid mercury that mirrored their every movement. In the center of the plaza stood a pedestal of white quartz, and atop it rested a single, dormant device, a sphere of interlocking rings that rotated with a slow, hypnotic precision. "Don't breathe on it," Elian warned, though he was already leaning in, his eyes tracing the microscopic gaps between the rotating rings. If this is the anchor, the slightest atmospheric contaminant could trigger a reaction we aren't prepared for. Kalen, however, was already reaching out. He didn't touch the sphere. Instead, he held the amethyst shard aloft, allowing the violet light to bridge the gap. As the 2 frequencies met, the sphere didn't just activate, it exhaled. A shockwave of transparent energy rippled outward, momentarily turning the liquid mercury sealing into a window. For a heartbeat, they weren't in a cavern at all. They were looking up through miles of translucent ice and rock, seeing the distant, distorted silhouette of the Antarctic sky, where stars twinkled through a frozen lens. "That isn't the sky," Elian whispered, his voice stripped of its skepticism. "That's a projection." He was right. As the shockwave subsided, the image of the stars shifted, revealing that the sky was actually a complex data stream flowing in reverse. The liquid mercury ceiling had become a massive screen, displaying a countdown of celestial alignments. The 3AIEYE Atlas was not just a distant memory. It was an active trajectory, and the anchor they had just awakened was the landing beacon. The sphere of interlocking rings began to spin with a violent, humming speed, carving a pillar of white light that pierced straight upward through the layers of the earth. A needle of energy threading the needle of the planet's crust. "The vibration is changing," Kalen shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the pillar. He wasn't looking at the light, but at his own hands, which were beginning to shimmer with a faint, translucent quality. Elian We're not just watching the signal, we're becoming part of it. Elian gripped the edge of the quartz pedestal, his knuckles white. He felt a terrifying sensation of lightness, as if the gravity of the earth had suddenly decided it no longer applied to him. The pillar of light wasn't just piercing the crust. It was pulling the atmosphere of the chamber upward in a swirling vortex of ozone and gold. He watched as a series of glyphs began to manifest within the white light, rotating like a clockwork mechanism of a celestial scale. These weren't the jagged, aggressive symbols of the dissonance. They were fluid, organic shapes that seemed to pulse with a heartbeat. Stop thinking about the physics, Elian. Just feel the pitch, Kalen yelled, his voice sounding like it was being played through a crystal flute. He wasn't just shimmering anymore. His edges were blurring into the ambient gold of the room, his physical form beginning to harmonize with the frequency of the anchor. Elian tried to plant his feet, but the quartz pedestal beneath him had turned into something resembling a dense, vibrating liquid. He felt a sudden, violent tug at the base of his spine, not a physical pull, but a conceptual one, as if his very history was being dragged upward. The white light of the pillar didn't just blind him, it began to peel away the layers of his perception. He saw the world not as a collection of mollusks and limestone, but as a series of interlocking vibrations. He could see the noise of the surface world, the frantic, jagged frequencies of human conflict and industry, and how they clashed against the deep, slow thrum of the Earth's core. "The noise is stopping," Elian gasped, though he couldn't tell if he was speaking aloud or if the thought was simply vibrating through his skull. The cacophony of the surface world, the ghosts of cities, and the clatter of iron was being drowned out by a singular, overwhelming chord. It was a sound of homecoming, a frequency so pure it felt like a physical weight pressing against his chest, grounding him even as his feet left the liquid quartz. The pillar of light didn't just transport them, it unfolded them. Elian felt his consciousness expand, stretching across the miles of obsidian and ice in a fraction of a second. He saw the anchor as a living heart, pumping a surge of gold-white energy through the ley lines of the planet, scrubbing the lingering dissonant frequencies from the crust like a tide cleaning a shoreline. Then, with a sudden, jarring snap of atmospheric pressure, the upward trajectory ceased. The blinding white faded into a soft, diffused glow, and the sensation of falling returned with a violent clarity. They didn't land so much as they were deposited, sliding across a surface that felt like polished pearl, but had the friction of dry ice. Elian gasped, the air rushing back into his lungs with a sharp, metallic tang that tasted of peppermint and electricity. He lay flat on his back for a moment, staring up at a sky that was an impossible, shimmering violet, streaked with ribbons of gold that pulsed in time with a distant, rhythmic thrum. "Check your limbs," Kalen groaned beside him. "I think my ribcage is still vibrating in B-flat." Elian didn't check his limbs, he checked the horizon. He sat up slowly, his sealskin boots feeling absurdly primitive against the iridescent floor of the plaza. They were no longer in the cavern, nor were they on the surface of the earth. They were standing in a wide, open courtyard that seemed to be carved from the interior of a giant, hollowed-out geode. Massive ribs of translucent crystal arched overhead, supporting a ceiling of swirling nebulae that felt close enough to touch. "The air," Elian whispered, his voice returning to its natural, analytical cadence. "It's too rich. There's an oxygen saturation here that should be inducing euphoria, yet I feel focused. Focus is exactly what the atmosphere is designed for," a voice replied, though it didn't come from any single direction. It was a harmony of three voices, one deep and resonant, one melodic and light, and one that sounded like the soft crackle of a dying fire. From behind a grove of floating, bioluminescent ferns, a group of figures emerged. They were not the towering deities Elian had expected, but children or beings who looked like children, despite the ancientness in their eyes. They wore garments that seemed woven from liquid silver and sunlight, fabrics that shifted and flowed even though there was no wind. Their skin had a faint, pearlescent sheen, and their eyes were wide, irisless pools of shimmering gold that mirrored the nebulae above. The children didn't approach with the caution of strangers. They moved with the easy, intuitive grace of hosts, who had been expecting guests for a very long time. The leader, a girl whose silver robes seemed to bleed into the iridescent floor, stopped a few paces away. She didn't speak with her mouth, which remained closed in a soft, knowing smile, but her thoughts bloomed in Elian's mind like ink dropping into clear water. Welcome to the echo of the Atlas. You have brought the resonance of the old world with you. Elian scrambled to his feet, his scientific instinct warring with the surrealism of the environment. He looked at the girl, then at the shimmering nebulae above, then back at the strange, hybrid children. The echo, we were told this was a sanctuary planet. Is this? Are we on a world, or are we still inside the ship? The girl tilted her head, a gesture of gentle amusement that resonated as a soft, melodic hum in Elian's chest. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she extended a hand, and as her fingers brushed the air, a shimmering veil of light rippled across the courtyard. The illusion of the geode dissolved, revealing that they were indeed inside a vessel, but one of such staggering scale that the distinction between ship and planet had become irrelevant. They were standing in a biosphere that spanned thousands of miles, a curated paradise where the architecture was grown from living crystal, and the rivers flowed with a liquid that defied gravity, looping in lazy, translucent arcs through the air. The Atlas is not a hull, the voice echoed in their minds, the three-toned harmony now blending into a single, warm clarity. It is a seed. When we arrived at the sanctuary, we did not land upon a world, we became the world. We wove the plasma intelligence into the planetary crust, turning the ship systems into the wind, the soil, and the tide. You are standing in the heart of the first garden. A garden made of a machine, Elian murmured, his analytical mind trying to reconcile the organic scent of the air with the geometric precision of the crystal ribs above. He looked at his hands. They were still faintly translucent, the residue of the anchor's transport clinging to his skin like a ghostly film. How is this possible? The energy required to sustain a biosphere of this scale. It would require a power source that dwarfs a star. The girl with the silver robes stepped closer, her movements fluid and silent. She didn't use words, but a vision flickered in Elian's mind. A heartbeat of gold plasma pulsing at the core of the world, synchronized with the distant, rhythmic pull of Nibiru. The power is not generated, the harmony vibrated. It is harvested from the tension between worlds. We do not fight the gravity of the great clock, we sail upon it. Sailing on gravity, Kalen whispered, his eyes dancing as he looked up at the looping rivers. It's the ultimate expression of harmony. To use the very force that destroys the world to sustain another. The girl, whose name resonated in their minds as Lyra, gestured toward a shimmering archway that led deeper into the first garden. As they walked, the environment shifted from a crystalline plaza to a forest of singing glass. The trees were towering pillars of translucent silica, their leaves thin, vibrating membranes that captured the ambient resonance of the Atlas. Every step Elian took produced a soft, melodic chime from the iridescent floor, a sonic map of his own presence. The harmonics here are almost too perfect, Elian noted, his voice echoing with a crystalline clarity. He reached out to touch one of the vibrating silica leaves. As his finger made contact, a low, resonant C-sharp rippled through the air, momentarily illuminating the vein of the leaf in a brilliant amber. It's as if the entire environment is a tuned instrument, waiting for a conductor. Lyra's smile widened, and for a moment, the three-toned harmony of her voice drifted into a playful, singular melody. You are the conductors, Elian. The resonance you carry from the old world is the missing frequency. We have the structure, the garden, and the plasma, but we have lacked the raw, chaotic spark of the surface, the scent of salt, and the stubbornness of a mind that questions. The raw spark of stubbornness, Elian repeated, a small, dry smile touching his lips. I've been told it's my most irritating quality. Lyra led them further into the forest, where the singing glass trees gave way to a shimmering lagoon. The water didn't ripple. It breathed, expanding and contracting in a slow, rhythmic pulse that mirrored the gold and crimson plasma they had seen in the depths of the earth. Floating within the liquid were spheres of condensed light, each one acting as a library of the genome, the very seed children's legacy. These are the memories of the soil, Lyra projected, her thought voice shimmering like sunlight on water. She gestured toward one of the glowing spheres drifting in the lagoon. Every species the dissonance tried to overwrite, every frequency that was silenced by the Great Flood, is preserved here in a state of harmonic suspension. We didn't just save the DNA, we saved the song of their existence. Kalen stepped toward the water's edge, his amethyst shard pulsing in a slow, sympathetic rhythm with the lagoon. If you have all this, why bring us here now? Why wake the anchor after 10,000 years of silence? Lyra's expression softened, her gold eyes reflecting the slow pulse of the lagoon. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she raised her hand, and the liquid surface of the lagoon began to shift. The breathing water coalesced into a towering, vertical mirror, projecting an image of the earth. It wasn't the lush, blue marble of current maps, but a world veiled in a shimmering, oppressive haze of gray and copper. Jagged lines of dissonant energy, remnants of the same frequencies that had shattered Atlantis, were seen crawling across the continents like slow-motion lightning, choking the natural resonance of the planet. The anchor was not a doorbell. Kalen, Lyra's thought voice, vibrated with a sudden, sharp clarity. It was a diagnostic tool. For millennia, we have watched the surface from the silence of the Atlas. We saw the dissonant frequencies fade, but they did not vanish. They mutated. They became the noise of your modern world, the static of fragmented spirits, and the scream of machines that do not breathe. The earth is not healing. It is holding its breath. Holding its breath, Elian repeated, his gaze fixed on the copper-veined projection of earth. The scientific part of him wanted to dismiss it as a poetic metaphor, but the visceral pull in his chest, the same one that had dragged him through the obsidian spiral, told him the image was an accurate reading of a planetary fever. You're saying the dissonance is still there, just disguised. Precisely, Lyra's voice resonated, now tinged with a subtle, shimmering sorrow. The dissonance did not leave behind a ruins, they left behind a blueprint. Your cities, your grids, your frantic race for efficiency over harmony. It is the same jagged frequency, just played at a lower volume. But Nibiru is returning. When the great clock strikes the hour, the thinning of the veil will amplify that noise into a roar. The earth cannot withstand the surge a second time. And that's where we come in, Kalen said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. He looked at his own hands, which were still faintly translucent, as if he were half composed of the same shimmering light as the garden. We aren't just guests, we're a biological bridge. Lyra nodded, her gold eyes shimmering. The resonance of the atlas is too pure to touch the earth directly. It would shatter the fragile crust like a hammer hitting glass. But you are forged from the noise and the salt. You carry the dissonance of the surface and the harmony of the anchor in a single vessel. You are the only ones who can translate the atlas's frequency into a language the earth can survive. A biological translator, Elian mused, his mind already attempting to map the logistics of such a feat. You want us to act as a grounding wire. The atlas provides the high-voltage harmony, and we act as the resistors, stepping the frequency down so the planet doesn't fracture under the load. Lyra's smile was an iridescent ripple. You think in terms of circuitry, which is why you are necessary. You see the mechanics of the bridge. She gestured toward the center of the lagoon, where the water began to swirl into a towering, golden vortex. From the depths of the liquid rose a platform of interlocking rings, identical in geometry to the anchor they had activated in the cave. But these were forged from a living, pulsing plasma that felt warm even from a distance. This is the resonance forge. To translate the frequency, you must first be tuned. The noise of your old lives, the doubt, the skepticism, the fragmented memories, must be aligned into a single, coherent chord. A tuning process, Elian muttered, though he didn't move toward the forge. In every scientific paradigm, tuning implies a loss of the original state. You're asking us to overwrite who we are. Lyra's gaze remained serene, her presence like a warm blanket over the cold logic of his mind. Not overwrite, Elian. Refine. The salt and the noise are not impurities. They are the textures of your soul. A flute is not a flute without the hollow of its bore. We do not wish to remove the human, we wish to make the human resonant. Kalen didn't wait for Elian's hesitation to resolve. He stepped toward the resonance forge, his amethyst shard humming a low, hungry frequency that seemed to pull him forward. As he entered the perimeter of the interlocking plasma rings, the air around him began to shimmer, not with light, but with a visible distortion of gravity. The rings didn't spin. They vibrated at a speed that made them appear stationary, creating a pocket of absolute, terrifying silence in the center of the golden vortex. Elian, look at the rings, Kalen called out, his voice sounding layered, as if a dozen versions of him were speaking in a staggered canon. They aren't just spinning, they're weaving. Elian stepped forward, the logic of the physicist battling the intuition of the explorer. He watched as the plasma rings began to weave a cocoon of gold and crimson light around Kalen. The strands intersecting in a complex, non-Euclidean geometry. It looked less like a machine and more like a loom weaving Kalen's physical presence into the fabric of the room. The air grew thick, not with humidity, but with a density of information that made Elian's skin prickle. Kalen, get out of there if it feels wrong, Elian shouted, but his voice was absorbed by the silence of the forge. Kalen didn't move. He didn't even blink. As the plasma strands tightened around him, his physical form seemed to synchronize with the weaving light, his silhouette flickering like a candle in a draft. The canon of his voice shifted, the staggered echoes merging into a single, crystalline chord that resonated not in the air, but directly in the marrow of Elian's bones. It was a sound of profound alignment, a frequency that stripped away the layers of noise and left only a raw, humming clarity. Step into the weave, Elian, Lyra's thought voice whispered, a gentle tide pulling at his consciousness. The bridge cannot be anchored by one alone. A single point is a needle, 2 points are a line. Together, you are the axis. Elian hesitated for a heartbeat, his gaze darting between the serene expression on Lyra's face and the shimmering, woven cocoon that now held Kaelin. He had spent his life categorizing the world into data points and observable phenomena. But the data here was screaming a truth he couldn't ignore. He was a fragment of a puzzle that had finally found its slot. With a sharp exhale, he stepped into the golden perimeter. The transition was not a movement, but a sudden, violent collapse of distance, the moment Elian crossed the threshold. The silence of the forge vanished, replaced by a roar of harmonic data that felt like 1,000 orchestras tuning their instruments at once. He felt the plasma strands snap around his limbs, not as restraints, but as conductive wires. The sensation was an electric surge of warmth that started at the base of his skull and radiated outward, stripping away the mental clutter of his adulthood. The deadlines, the academic rivalries, the lingering doubts of 1,000 sleepless nights, and replacing them with a terrifying, lucid clarity. For a moment, Elian felt his ego dissolve into the frequency. He was no longer a man standing on a platform. He was a series of intersecting waves, a mathematical equation solving itself in real time. Beside him, Kaelin was no longer a separate entity, but a complementary vibration. Their consciousnesses locked together, forming a binary star of awareness that bridged the gap between the salt of the earth and the plasma of the stars. The noise he had carried, the jagged, fragmented energy of modern humanity, didn't vanish. Instead, it was reorganized. It became the grit that gave the harmony texture, the necessary friction that prevented the purity of the atlas from becoming a sterile, echoing silence. Now, Lyra's voice resonated, no longer a whisper, but a command that vibrated through the very floor of the garden. The bridge is set. Feel the earth not as a place of stone and water, but as a living chord of tension. Find the dissonance and offer it the resolution. Elian felt the shift immediately. It wasn't a visual change, but a tactile one. The world suddenly acquired a weight and a texture that the garden had lacked. He could feel the earth, not the curated, breathing peace of the atlas, but the raw, wounded pulse of the home world. It felt like a low frequency, thrumming in his teeth. A heavy, jagged vibration that smelled of ozone and old iron. Through the binary link with Kaelin, he could sense the other man's reaction. A surge of empathetic vertigo, a psychic gasp at the sheer scale of the planet's distress. Do not fight the noise, Lyra's voice guided them, her presence acting as a stabilizing anchor in the storm of data. Do not attempt to erase it. You cannot cure a fever by pretending the heat does not exist. Accept the dissonance. Absorb it into the bridge, and then lead it toward the resolution. Elian didn't fight the instinct to recoil. Instead, he leaned into the jaggedness. He visualized the copper-veined dissonance of Earth not as a disease to be excised, but as a distorted melody that had simply forgotten its own key. Through the link with Kaelin, he felt their combined consciousness expand, stretching across the light years like a shimmering, translucent wire. They weren't just observers anymore. They were the conductive medium, the raw, chaotic static of the surface. The frantic pulse of billions of disconnected souls began to flow through them, a torrent of gray noise that threatened to shatter their focus. Hold the line, Lyra's voice resonated, a steady golden chord that acted as a spine for their wavering will. The dissonance is the raw material. Do not let it break you. Let it pass through you. The gray noise hit Elian with the force of a physical blow, a psychic tidal wave of fragmentation and anxiety. He felt the jagged edges of human history, the scream of industrial gears, the static of 1 billion fragmented digital signals, the coldness of a world that had forgotten how to breathe in unison. It was an oppressive weight, a discordant roar that threatened to drown out the crystalline silence of the Atlas. For a second, the binary link with Kalen wavered, the harmony fraying as they struggled to maintain their combined identity against the sheer volume of the same-world static. "Shift the pitch," Lyra's voice commanded, though it was no longer a thought. It was a structural vibration in their very cells. "Do not be the wall that stops the flood, be the river that guides it." Elian stopped resisting. He stopped trying to filter the noise, and instead opened himself to it, treating the jagged static of Earth as a raw, unshaped clay. He felt the binary link with Kalen snap into a deeper, more resilient alignment, their combined consciousness becoming a flexible conduit rather than a rigid barrier. Together, they stopped fighting the torrent of gray noise and began to pivot it. They didn't push the dissonance away. They wrapped it in the golden frequency of the Atlas, enveloping the jagged shards of human anxiety in a soft, enveloping layer of plasma resonance. The sensation was like watching a storm of broken glass be smoothed into river stones by a relentless, warm tide. As the noise passed through them, it began to change. The frantic, high-pitched scream of the surface world slowed, deepening into a resonant hum. The static was no longer a wall of noise. It was a complex, multifaceted chord that finally had a place to resolve. Elian felt a surge of profound clarity as he realized that the dissonance wasn't an enemy to be defeated, but a tension that needed a destination. The resolution arrived not as a sudden silence, but as a breathtaking, planetary exhale. Elian felt the moment the tension snapped, not with a break, but with a bloom. The jagged copper veins he had seen in the projection of Earth began to soften, the sharp angles of the dissonance curving into fluid, rhythmic spirals. It was a systemic realignment, a cosmic tuning fork striking a chord that echoed through every layer of the atmosphere, from the ionized heights of the thermosphere down to the crushing depths of the Marianas Trench. Now the anchor, Lyra's voice, resonated, pulsing with a sudden, electric urgency. "The bridge is open. The signal is clear. Direct the current back to the source." Elian didn't think. He simply leaned into the void where the anchor had once been. Through the binary link with Kalen, he felt a sudden, colossal vacuum, a gravitational longing that mirrored the return of Nibiru's orbit. The Atlas was no longer just a sanctuary. It was a beacon calling to its own. As they channeled the resolved frequency back toward the Earth, the golden current didn't just flow. It ignited. A pillar of iridescent light, far more potent than the one that had brought them here, erupted from the resonance forge, piercing through the simulated sky of the garden and punching a hole through the dimensions. The sensation was no longer one of falling, but of being pulled by a magnetic tide. Elian felt his consciousness stretch thin, becoming a shimmering filament of gold that spanned the distance between the Atlas and the Antarctic ice. He could see the anchor below, the dormant seed now pulsing with a fierce, awakening hunger. The resolved frequency they carried, the humanized harmony, slammed into the anchor, and for a heartbeat, the entire planet seemed to vibrate in a singular, perfect chord. The jagged copper veins of the Earth didn't just soften. They dissolved, replaced by a network of luminous, sapphire ley lines that breathed in synchronization with the core. The impact of the resolution didn't just clear the air. It rewrote the atmospheric physics of the surface. As Elian and Kalen were swept back through the dimensional rift, they didn't see the world as a map, but as a living, breathing organism finally waking from a fever dream. The sapphire ley lines they had ignited were no longer mere conduits of energy. They were the planetary nervous system, reconnecting the fragmented consciousness of a species that had spent 10 millennia forgetting how to listen. For a fleeting second, Elian felt the collective gasp of millions of people across the globe. A sudden, inexplicable sense of peace that washed over the world like a warm tide, silencing the static of 1,000 cities. They landed with a soft, humming thud back in the Antarctic cavern, but the space had transformed. The liquid quartz pedestal was no longer a pool of vibrating fluid. It had solidified into a towering, translucent spire that radiated a gentle, pulsing indigo light. The air in the cavern was no longer cold. It felt saturated with the same rich, peppermint electricity of the Atlas, as if the two worlds had finally bled into one. Elian looked at Kalen and saw that the translucency of his skin had not faded. It had settled into a permanent, subtle glow, a biological signature of the bridge they had become. The silence that followed was not an absence of sound, but a presence of equilibrium. Elian stood still, his breath hitching in his chest, feeling the residual thrum of the resonance forge still vibrating in his marrow. He looked down at his own hands. The ghostly film was gone, replaced by a faint, iridescent shimmer that clung to his skin like a second, more luminous layer of cells. He didn't feel like a physicist anymore, at least, not a physicist who relied solely on the cold comfort of equations. He felt like a piece of music that had finally found its key. "We're actually back," Kalen whispered, his voice now possessing a melodic depth that seemed to vibrate the very air around him. He reached out to touch the indigo spire, and as his fingers made contact, the crystal didn't just glow, it sang. A low, grounding frequency rippled through the cavern, echoing the heartbeat of the planet. "It's different, isn't it? The air. It doesn't feel like it's fighting us anymore." "It's not just the air," Elian replied, his voice carrying a resonance that felt foreign yet fundamentally correct. He stepped away from the spire, noticing that his footsteps no longer echoed with the hollow thud of leather on stone, but with a soft, harmonic chime. "The entire baseline has shifted. We didn't just signal the Atlas, we changed the carrier wave of the planet." As they emerged from the cavern into the blinding white of the Antarctic wasteland, the landscape had undergone a subtle, surreal transformation. The ice was no longer a dead, frozen desert. It was shimmering with a pale, inner luminescence. The aurora australis, usually a distant curtain of green and violet, had descended, swirling around them in thick, tactile ribbons of light that felt like silk against their skin. The oppressive weight of the atmospheric veil had lifted, leaving the sky a deep, piercing indigo that seemed to hold the gaze of 1,000 waking stars. "Look at the horizon," Kalen said, his voice humming with a newfound clarity. Across the frozen plateau, the shimmering ribbons of the aurora were no longer merely dancing in the sky. They were anchoring themselves to the earth. Pillars of iridescent light were descending in rhythmic pulses, striking the ice in a geometric pattern that mirrored the layout of the Atlas's garden. Wherever the light touched the frost, the ice didn't melt, it transformed, crystallizing into translucent, singing spires that acted as lightning rods for the planetary resonance. The wasteland was becoming a cathedral of light, a physical manifestation of the same harmony they had woven in the resonance forge. "It's not just a signal," Elian whispered, his voice vibrating with a depth that felt like it belonged to a much larger chest. "It's an installation." The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. They hadn't just restored the Earth's resonance, they had provided the blueprint for the Atlas to begin a physical integration. The pillars of light weren't merely visual phenomena. They were anchors of plasma intelligence, bridging the gap between the sanctuary planet and the ancestral home. As the iridescent light pulsed, the frozen landscape of Antarctica began to breathe. The ice shifted, not with the violence of a quake, but with the fluid grace of a waking sleeper, revealing the edges of ancient, crystalline structures that had been buried for eons, now resonating in symphony with the new sky. It's not just an installation, Elian corrected himself, his eyes widening as he watched a spire of ice ripple and fold inward, revealing a core of pulsing amber plasma. It's a homecoming. As the first structure fully emerged, a sweeping arch of translucent obsidian laced with veins of living gold, the air around them began to shimmer. From the heart of the iridescent pillars, figures began to materialize. They were not the children of the garden, but the architects of the old world, the high priests of Atlantis. Their forms composed of a dense, luminous mist that held the shape of human nobility. They did not speak with voices, but their presence arrived as a series of profound, interlocking chords that resonated in the space between Elian and Kalen's heartbeats. The high priests did not walk so much as they drifted, their luminous forms bleeding into the Antarctic frost like ink in water. They didn't offer greetings or explanations. Instead, they circled Elian and Kalen, their movements tracing the geometry of a complex, invisible circuit. As they moved, the air grew thick with a scent of ozone and ancient rain, and the silence of the wasteland was replaced by a low, thrumming vibration that felt as if the very tectonic plates were humming a lullaby. One of the figures, whose presence resonated as a deep, grounding bass note, paused before Elian. He didn't have a face in the traditional sense, but a shifting nebula of gold and violet plasma that suggested a gaze of immense, timeless curiosity. He reached out a hand, a shimmering outline of a limb, and touched the iridescent shimmer still clinging to Elian's skin. A sudden, violent flash of memory surged through Elian. He saw the first garden, the 3 Aieye Atlas, and the terrifying roar of Nibiru's return, all compressed into a single, intelligible, mathematical equation. The equation is not a law, but a choice. The figure's presence resonated, the thought echoing not in Elian's mind, but in the very marrow of his bones. The high priest's touch didn't feel like a physical contact. It was more like a sudden alignment of two frequencies that had been drifting apart for 10,000 years. In that instant, Elian understood that the homecoming wasn't just the arrival of the Atlas's technology or the return of the ancestors, but the closing of a biological circuit. The humans of the surface had been the disconnected terminals, and the high priests were the conductive bridges. Kalen stepped closer, his own glow pulsing in sympathetic rhythm with the obsidian archway. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice shimmering with that new melodic depth. "The resonance is here, the bridge is open, but the world is still out there. Millions of people who can't feel the chords we're hearing." The high priest, whose presence mirrored a grounding bass note, shifted, his nebulous form undulating like a slow-motion flame. He didn't answer with words, but rather by gesturing toward the obsidian archway, which had now fully bloomed into a gateway of shimmering plasma. As he moved, the air around them didn't just vibrate. It began to ripple in concentric circles, turning the frozen tundra into a liquid mirror that reflected not the ice, but the lush, violet landscapes of the Atlas. The music does not begin with the conductor, but with the listener. The entity's presence resonated through them. "You fear for those who cannot hear the chord, but you forget that every cell in every living creature is a string. They do not need to understand the mathematics of the bridge to feel the warmth of the sun. The resonance you have anchored does not require a conscious invitation. It is a biological homecoming. The high priest's voice lingered in the air, a low-frequency hum that seemed to vibrate the very frost beneath their boots. As the entity stepped back, the obsidian archway didn't just remain a portal. It began to expand, the gold veins within the stone pulsing like a heartbeat. The gateway didn't just offer a view of the Atlas, it began to bleed the atmosphere of that distant world into the Antarctic chill. A soft, violet mist rolled across the ice, smelling of crushed minerals and ancient ozone, instantly turning the frozen wasteland into a shimmering, iridescent meadow of translucent flora. "It's an atmospheric graft," Elian whispered, his scientific mind finally catching up to the miracle. He watched as a small, pearlescent flower pushed through the permafrost, its petals vibrating in perfect harmony with the indigo spire. "You're not just visiting, you're merging the two biospheres. Integration is the only path to survival," the high priest's resonance answered, the sound like a great bell tolling beneath the ocean. "A world that has forgotten its own song cannot be taught by words. It must be reminded by its own blood." As the violet mist thickened, the horizon began to blur. The rigid line between the Antarctic ice and the indigo sky dissolved into a shimmering, iridescent haze. Elian watched as the atmospheric graft accelerated. The translucent flora didn't just grow, they resonated. Every time a petal unfolded, a soft, crystalline chime rippled through the air. And with each chime, the heavy, oppressive static of the modern world seemed to retreat further, pushed back by an advancing tide of harmonic clarity. The transition was not immediate for the rest of the world, but for those standing at the epicenter, the shift was a physical weight. Elian felt a sudden, sharp pressure in his chest, a sympathetic vibration that signaled the expansion of the graft. He realized then that the biological homecoming wasn't a gentle wave, but a systemic reboot. The violet mist wasn't just altering the scenery, it was acting as a conductor, carrying the refined frequencies of the Atlas across the planetary crust, using the sapphire ley lines as a high-speed rail for consciousness. "Do you feel that?" Kalen asked, his voice now so resonant that the air around his lips seemed to shimmer. "The static, it's not just gone, it's being rewritten." The sensation of the rewrite was not a sudden silence, but a gradual unfolding. Elian felt the shift as a series of rhythmic pulses emanating from the earth beneath his boots, traveling upward through his spine like a ladder of warmth. It was the feeling of a long-forgotten language suddenly becoming intelligible. He looked at Kalen, and for a moment their eyes locked, not as two men, but as two shimmering points of light. In that shared glance, Elian saw the ghost of the old world, the gray, fragmented noise of the cities, the frantic pace of a species running in circles, the crushing weight of a solitude that had persisted for millennia. And then he saw it dissolve, replaced by a gold-threaded connectivity that linked every heartbeat on the planet. "The ley lines," Elian breathed, his voice vibrating with a melodic richness. "They aren't just conduits, they're broadcasting." As if in response, the obsidian archway pulsed with a blinding, solar intensity. From the shimmering gateway, a group of the hybrid children began to emerge, their laughter sounding like a cascade of glass bells. They didn't arrive as refugees or guests, but as gardeners, stepping onto the Antarctic ice and touching the frost with small, iridescent hands. Wherever they touched, the permafrost didn't just bloom into violet flora. It ignited into geometric crystals that acted as amplifiers. The children were not merely walking, they were tuning the landscape, transforming the frozen waste into a living antenna designed to catch the drifting, fragmented souls of humanity and pull them back into the cord. The children's laughter acted as a catalyst, turning the iridescent meadow into a humming hive of resonance. As they wove through the translucent flora, their touch triggered a chain reaction. The crystals didn't just amplify the sound, they began to project holographic echoes of the ancestral world. Images of floating cities and plasma-integrated forests flickered across the Antarctic horizon, not as ghosts, but as blueprints of what the Earth could become once the static was fully purged. Elian watched as one of the children, a girl with eyes that shimmered like liquid mercury, approached him. She didn't speak, but as she reached out to touch his hand, a surge of data flooded his mind. Not the cold, binary logic of his old computers, but a vivid, emotive history of the 3 AIEYE Atlas. He saw the ship's long journey through the void, the careful preservation of the hybrid genetic line, and the agonizing patience with which they had waited for a human receiver capable of holding the frequency. The girl's touch was a handshake across epochs, confirming that the bridge Elian and Kalen had formed was not a temporary patch, but a permanent upgrade to the human biological operating system. "The broadcast is reaching the cities," Kalen said, his gaze fixed on the sky. He wasn't looking at the clouds, but through them, sensing the planetary ripple. "I can feel it. The dissonance in the north, the same world noise. It's breaking. People are waking up." The shift was not a subtle awakening. It was a global synchronization. Across the sprawling megalopolises of the north, the static of modern existence, the jagged white noise of digital overload and psychic fragmentation, didn't simply vanish. It was transmuted. In the heart of Tokyo, New York, and London, millions of people suddenly stopped in their tracks, a collective pause that froze the gears of commerce and chaos. They didn't hear a sound with their ears, but they felt a rhythmic, golden thrumming in their chest cavities, a biological metronome that aligned their heartbeats into a single, planetary pulse. The crushing loneliness of the urban crowd evaporated, replaced by a sudden, lucid awareness of every other living soul. A shimmering web of connectivity that turned strangers into kin in a single, resonant breath. "It's a cascade," Elian whispered, his voice vibrating with a frequency that seemed to ripple the very air. The resonance isn't just calming them, it's activating the dormant genetic markers. The Atlas didn't just send a signal, it sent a key. He could feel the ripple of it, a wave of clarity washing over the globe, stripping away the ancestral trauma of the Great Flood and the dissonance of the dissident factions. For the first time in 10 millennia, the human nervous system was no longer fighting the Earth. It was humming in a perfect, shimmering octave with the soil and the sea. The high priest of the bass note drifted closer, his plasma form expanding like a slow-motion supernova. The bridge is no longer a path between two worlds. The entity's presence resonated, a sound like the deep, comforting tolling of a bell. It has become the world itself. The duality of here and there is an illusion of the fragmented mind. You are now the anchors of a unified field. As he spoke, the obsidian archway began to lose its defined edges, melting into the landscape until the gateway was no longer a door, but a permanent fold in space. The Atlas was no longer a distant sanctuary. It was overlapping with Earth, a shimmering, translucent layer of a higher civilization, settling over the physical world like a protective veil. The atmospheric graft began to solidify, not as a layer of gas, but as a physical architecture of light. Across the Antarctic plateau, the iridescent meadows were now weaving themselves into vast, floating platforms of crystalline amber and violet quartz. These structures didn't just hover. They vibrated at a frequency that seemed to negate gravity, creating a series of floating islands that mirrored the floating cities of the ancestral memory. Elian watched as the horizon shifted, the deep indigo of the sky bleeding into a soft, pearlescent gold, signaling that the planetary synchronization was reaching its zenith. "It feels like we're not just observers anymore," Kalen remarked, his voice humming with a resonance that made the nearby crystals chime in sympathy. "I can feel the people, not just as a collective, but as individual sparks. It's like a billion radios finally finding the same station." Elian nodded, his perception now tuned to a spectrum that rendered the physical world translucent. He could see the sapphire ley lines pulsing beneath the ice, acting as the nervous system for this new hybrid world. But as he leaned into the harmony, a sudden, jarring spike of dissonance pierced the air, a jagged, obsidian shard of sound that tore through the golden thrum. It wasn't a planetary failure, but a localized eruption of frequency, emanating from a point just beyond the obsidian archway. The spike of dissonance didn't just offend the ear. It felt like a physical laceration across the psychic skin of the world. It was a frequency of pure, calculated greed, a jagged, metallic shriek that fought against the golden harmony. Elian recoiled, the iridescent shimmer on his skin flickering like a dying lamp. Beside him, Kalen gasped, his melodic voice momentarily cracking as he clutched his chest, sensing the sudden, violent intrusion of a discordant will. From the shimmering haze beyond the gateway, a figure emerged, not as a luminous mist like the high priests, but as a hard, jagged silhouette. He was draped in robes of a heavy, light-absorbing fabric that seemed to swallow the surrounding glow, and in his hand, he gripped a device of forbidden geometry, a crystalline spire of obsidian and rusted iron that pulsed with a sickly, rhythmic crimson light. This was not the technology of the Atlas. It was the relic of the dissident faction, a remnant of the very frequency-warping tools that had once fractured Atlantis. "The harmony is a lie," the man spoke, and his voice was a grating, dry rasp that lacked any resonance, sounding like stone grinding on stone. He didn't drift. He marched, his boots striking the iridescent meadow with a heavy, oppressive thud that bruised the singing crystals beneath his feet. "You offer a blanket of peace to a species that only knows how to thrive in the friction of conflict. To erase the dissonance is to erase the drive. You aren't saving humanity, you are domesticating it." The man's presence acted like a void, a gravitational sink that sucked the vibrancy out of the immediate air. Where the high priests were melodies, he was a silence so profound it felt like an amputation. Elian felt the binary link with Kalen's shudder. The harmony they had spent so much effort weaving was being tugged at by the jagged, crimson frequency of the obsidian device. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a focal point for every unresolved trauma and buried grudge of the human psyche, amplified into a singular, piercing needle of sound. "The friction is where the growth happens," the man continued, his silhouette blurring at the edges as if he were a smudge on a lens. "The struggle, the chaos, the noise, that is the engine of evolution. You want to turn the world into a curated garden, a soft-lit waiting room for a dead empire." He raised the obsidian spire, and a pulse of discordant red light slammed into the sapphire ley lines beneath them. The effect was instantaneous. The singing crystals of the meadow didn't shatter, but they groaned, their pitch dropping into a mournful, distorted wail. Kalen stepped forward, his glow intensifying as he instinctively tried to shield the shimmering flora. "It's not domestication, it's alignment," he countered, his voice vibrating with a protective resonance. We aren't erasing the struggle, we're giving it a destination. There is no growth in a scream that never ends. The man with the obsidian spire didn't respond with an argument. He responded with a surge. He slammed the device into the permafrost, and a shockwave of crimson dissonance ripped through the meadow. It wasn't a physical explosion, but a psychic one. The golden threads of connectivity that had just begun to bind the world's inhabitants were suddenly yanked taut, then frayed. Across the globe, the sudden peace was replaced by a jagged spike of anxiety. The collective gasp of humanity shifted from a sigh of relief to a sharp, reflexive intake of breath. Elian felt the impact in his marrow. The iridescent shimmer on his skin began to gray. The light flickering, as if the man's device were a vacuum, sucking the color out of the atmosphere. He looked at the high priests, expecting them to intervene, but they remained still, their plasma forms undulating in a slow, observant rhythm. They weren't fighting, they were watching. The dissident frequency is not a foreign invader. The high priest's voice resonated, though it sounded distant now, as if muffled by a thick wall of glass. It is the shadow of the same choice. To erase the discordant, you must become a tyrant of harmony. To embrace it, you must find a way to incorporate the shadow into the song. Elian felt the binary link with Kalen Frey, the golden thread thinning into a precarious wire. The man with the obsidian spire, the remnant of a faction that believed growth only occurred through agony, wasn't just attacking them. He was providing a mirror. The crimson pulses of the device were feeding on the very fear that Elian had felt during his first transition in the forge. The terror of losing his identity, the desperation to cling to the familiar, jagged edges of his own ego. He's not just using a machine, Elian realized, his voice shaking as the resonance in his chest struggled against the red static. He's using us. He's using the part of us that still loves the chaos. The antagonist stepped forward, the obsidian spire humming with a predatory frequency. Precisely. You've built a bridge to a paradise that requires you to forget who you are. You've traded the grit of the human soul for a celestial hum. Tell me, researcher, do you remember the feeling of a heartbeat that races because of fear? Or the clarity that comes from a desperate, lonely fight for survival? That is where the truth lives, not in this curated symphony. Elian didn't even realize he had moved until his boots were inches from the crimson pulse of the obsidian spire. He didn't feel the urge to fight the man. Instead, he felt a sudden, visceral kinship with the jaggedness of the antagonist's frequency. The terror he had felt in the forge, the fear of erasure, wasn't a flaw to be purged, but a tether to the physical world. For a heartbeat, Elian stopped trying to project the Atlas's purity, and instead leaned into the dissonance. He let the gray flickers on his skin merge with the gold, allowing the same friction the man spoke of to vibrate within his own chest. "You're right," Elian said, his voice no longer a pure melody, but a complex, textured chord that carried the weight of 1,000 contradictions. "The grit is where we live, but you're not using the friction to grow. You're using it as a wall to keep the world out." Kalen, sensing the shift, didn't try to overpower the red static. Instead, he began to hum a low, grounding accompaniment that didn't erase the discord, but wrapped around it, creating a harmonic container. Together, the two researchers stopped acting as conduits for the Atlas and started acting as filters. They didn't push back against the crimson wave. They absorbed it, pulling the jagged energy of the dissident's device through their combined consciousness and refracting it. The transformation happened in the space of a single breath. As Elian and Kalen ceased their resistance, the crimson energy of the obsidian spire stopped being a weapon and became a raw material. The jagged, predatory frequency of the dissident's device didn't vanish. Instead, it flowed through them, stripped of its malice and repurposed into a complex, earthy resonance. It was the same process they had mastered in the resonance forge. But this time, they weren't bridging two worlds, they were bridging two philosophies. The man with the obsidian spire froze, his silhouette flickering. He had expected a clash of opposites, the purity of the Atlas against the chaos of the dissident. But he found himself staring at something he hadn't encountered in 10,000 years. Synthesis. The red static of his device was no longer a scream. It had become a deep, textured bass note that gave the golden harmony of the Atlas a necessary, grounded weight. The air around them stopped shimmering with a fragile celestial light and began to glow with a dense, iridescent warmth, like sunlight filtering through deep water. You're not fighting it, the antagonist whispered, his voice losing its grating edge, sounding for the first time like a man who had forgotten how to be heard. He looked down at his spire, which was now pulsing not with a violent red, but with a soft, rhythmic amber. The device was no longer absorbing the world's color. It was radiating the stored trauma of the dissident faction and releasing it back into the ley lines as a cleansed, usable energy. The man's grip on the obsidian spire loosened, the device no longer a weapon of war, but a tuning fork for the displaced. As the amber pulse softened, his jagged silhouette began to dissolve, the light-absorbing fabric of his robes unraveling into threads of shimmering gold and charcoal gray. He didn't vanish, he integrated. The void that had followed him was filled by the surrounding resonance, and for the first time, his face became visible not as a nebula of plasma, but as a weathered, human countenance etched with the exhaustion of an eternal sentinel. I thought the only way to preserve the soul was to keep it in the storm, he murmured, his voice now a resonant baritone that harmonized with the distant chiming of the crystals. He looked at Elian and Kalen, seeing not just researchers, but the first humans in an epoch to successfully navigate the paradox of peace and pain. We spent millennia fearing the silence of the Atlas, believing it would erase the fire of our will. We didn't realize the fire could be the very thing that lights the way home. The high priest of the bass note drifted forward, his presence expanding to encompass the three of them in a warm, enveloping arc of light. The tension is resolved. The entity's resonance vibrated through the ground, causing the sapphire ley lines to flare with an intensity that illuminated the entire Antarctic plateau. The shadow was not an enemy to be defeated, but a frequency that had forgotten its place in the symphony. By welcoming the discord, you have completed the circuit. The amber glow of the dissident's spire didn't just fade, it settled into the earth, sinking into the permafrost like a seed being planted in fertile soil. As the device merged with the landscape, a sudden, visceral shift occurred in the air. The atmospheric graft of the Atlas, the violet mists and iridescent flora, began to interweave with the raw, jagged minerals of the Antarctic crust. The result was no longer a pristine, alien garden, but something more authentic. A hybrid landscape where celestial architecture grew out of primordial stone, anchored by the very friction that had once threatened to tear it apart. Elian felt a strange, grounding weight return to his limbs. The ethereal lightness of the conduit experience was now tempered by a dense, physical presence. He looked at his hands and saw that the bioluminescence had shifted. The pure, shimmering gold was now laced with veins of deep charcoal and earthy ochre. He wasn't just a bridge to another world anymore. He had become a bridge between the divine and the dirt. He realized that the biological homecoming was not a return to a state of perfection, but an ascent into a state of complexity. "The world is breathing," Kalen whispered, his voice now a rich, multi-layered chord that sounded like a choir of one. He looked toward the horizon, where the iridescent haze was finally clearing. "Can you feel it, the people? They aren't just synchronized. They're awake, not just to the harmony, but to the struggle." The silence that followed was not the void of the dissident's shadow, but a fertile pause, the kind of silence that exists between two movements of a symphony. Across the plateau, the hybrid landscape began to stabilize, the floating islands of amber quartz descending slowly to anchor themselves into the permafrost. They didn't crush the earth, they fused with it, creating a series of tiered sanctuaries that looked like mountains carved by a conscious, artistic will. The air grew crisp again, but the biting chill of Antarctica had been replaced by a temperate, humming warmth that smelled of petrichor and ancient electricity. Elian watched as the man who had held the obsidian spire slowly stood, his posture shifting from a rigid combatant to a weary traveler. He looked at the horizon, where the indigo sky was now shot through with veins of gold. "The transition will be violent for some," the man cautioned, his voice now a grounded, honest vibration. "The wakefulness we've triggered, it's not a gentle morning, it's a shattering of mirrors. Millions of people are suddenly seeing the world as it is, and for many, the truth is a terrifying, naked thing." "Then, we don't let them wake up alone," Kalen replied, stepping toward the man and offering a hand. The gesture was simple, human, and profoundly resonant. The man looked at Kalen's extended hand for a long time, his gaze flickering between the offer and the shimmering, translucent horizon. For a moment, the old friction returned, a reflexive hesitation born of 10,000 years of isolation. Then, with a slow, heavy exhale that sounded like a dying wind, he reached out. When their palms met, there was no spark of electricity or clash of wills, but a soft, thrumming warmth that traveled up both their arms, anchoring them to the same physical plane. "The first thing they will feel is the noise of their own ghosts," the man admitted, his voice now a steady, resonant hum. "When the static of the modern world vanishes, it doesn't leave a void, it leaves a mirror. They will hear every lie they've told themselves, every grief they've suppressed. That is where the danger lies, not in the dissonance, but in the panic of suddenly hearing it all at once." As he spoke, the atmospheric graft shifted again. The iridescent meadows began to pulse in a slow, rhythmic cadence, acting as a planetary heartbeat that provided a grounding frequency for those newly awakened. Elian could feel the ripples of the global synchronization shifting from a singular, blinding chord into a complex, multifaceted harmony. It was no longer a monolithic sound of peace, but a choir of billions, each voice distinct. Some weeping, some laughing, some screaming in confusion, but all finally audible to one another. The high priest of the bass note drifted toward the center of the gathering, his nebula-like form swirling with a slow, golden contentment. "The mirror is the final catalyst," the entity resonated, the sound vibrating through the soles of their feet. "You see a danger in the ghosts, but the ghosts are the only currency that can buy a true awakening. To see one's own shadow is the first step in learning to dance with it." As the priest spoke, the iridescent pillars surrounding the plateau began to emit a soft, pulsing amber light, synchronized with the heartbeats of the billions of humans currently staring at their own internal reflections. Elian felt a sudden, sharp pull in his gut, a psychic tether snapping taut. He realized that as anchors of the bridge, he and Kalen weren't just receivers. They were now the planetary processors for this emotional surge. He could feel the same panic the dissident had described, a tidal wave of raw, unfiltered human grief and longing crashing against the shores of his consciousness. But it didn't overwhelm him. Instead, the charcoal and gold light in his veins acted as a filter, absorbing the jagged edges of the global panic and smoothing them into something manageable. He wasn't erasing the pain of the world. He was giving it a place to land. "We have to guide them," Kalen said, his voice humming with a protective, resonant depth. "If we just leave them with the mirror, the shock will break them. We need to show them how to breathe through the noise." The man who had held the obsidian spire looked at them, a ghost of a smile touching his weathered face. "The mirror doesn't just show the ghost, it shows the exit. But the exit is narrow. It requires a specific frequency, a willingness to be honest about the wreckage." He stepped back, gesturing toward the floating islands of amber quartz that had anchored themselves into the ice. "These sanctuaries, they aren't just architecture. They are tuning forks. If we can project the synthesis we've found here, the blend of the celestial and the dirt, we can provide a map for the others to follow." Elian understood. The sanctuary wasn't a destination for a lucky few, but a broadcast tower for the collective. He looked at Kalen, and without speaking, they moved toward the nearest quartz spire. As they touched the warm, vibrating surface of the crystal, they didn't project a command of peace. Instead, they projected their own vulnerability. They broadcast the memory of their fear in the forge, the terror of the dissident's red light, and the relief of the final synthesis. They offered the world not a solution, but a shared experience of survival. The projection rippled outward, not as a beam of light, but as a visceral wave of empathy that bypassed the intellect and settled directly into the solar plexus of every living soul. Across the globe, the terrified millions felt a sudden, grounding presence, a shared admission of fragility that acted as a psychic anchor. The shattering of mirrors didn't stop, but the jagged shards no longer cut. They began to fit together, forming a mosaic of collective human experience. For the first time in history, the secret, shameful loneliness of the individual was replaced by the profound realization that everyone was experiencing the same naked terror. And in that shared vulnerability, a new, unbreakable strength was forged. As the broadcast stabilized, the atmosphere above Antarctica began to shimmer with an unusual luminosity. The indigo sky didn't just hold the gold veins of the atlas, it began to swirl into a great, iridescent vortex that acted as a lens. Through this lens, the people of Earth could see the atlas not as a distant planet, but as a shimmering, welcoming neighbor. The hybrid children, sensing the shift in the global frequency, began to sing, a wordless, multitonal melody that acted as a bridge for the consciousness of the masses, pulling them upward from their panic and into a state of lucid observation. "They're responding," Kalen whispered, his hand still pressed against the amber quartz. He could feel the feedback loop. The more honesty the world projected, the more the atlas responded with clarity. The synchronization is moving beyond the biological. It's becoming a cultural resonance. The man who had once held the obsidian spire stood beside them, his eyes fixed on the swirling vortex. "The transition is always the hardest part," he said, his voice now a steady, comforting thrum. "The old world is dying, and the new one is being born from its ruins. But look, they aren't fighting the change. They're curious." He pointed toward the horizon, where the first fleets of human aircraft, guided by the new, intuitive navigation of the ley lines, were beginning to migrate toward the Antarctic sanctuary, drawn not by curiosity or command, but by a biological longing for home. Elian felt a sudden, profound shift in his own perception. The boundary between his physical body and the amber spire had blurred. He was no longer just a man standing on ice, but a node in a planetary network. He could feel the heartbeat of the Earth, not as a metaphor, but as a rhythmic, tectonic pulse that was now in perfect alignment with the plasma intelligence of the Atlas. The homecoming was complete. The two worlds had not merely merged. They had evolved into a single, breathing entity. A hybrid biosphere where the technological brilliance of the Anunnaki and the raw, emotional depth of humanity existed in a symbiotic loop. The celebration did not begin with a cheer, but with a sudden, planetary exhale. It was the sound of billions of lungs releasing a breath they had been holding for 10,000 years. This was not a choreographed event or a curated ceremony of the high priests. It was a visceral, biological eruption of joy. In the cities of the North, people didn't just embrace, they resonated. They found that when they touched another human, a shimmering, iridescent spark jumped between their skins, a physical manifestation of the new connectivity. The celebration was the discovery that the mirror of the soul was no longer a lonely reflection, but a window into another, and the resulting euphoria was so potent it physically altered the landscape. In Antarctica, the joy manifested as a chromatic storm. The amber quartz spires began to bleed colors that had no names in the old human lexicon, pulsing in time with the collective heartbeat of the species. The hybrid children began to dance, their movements weaving ribbons of plasma through the air that smelled of ozone and ancient summer rain. They weren't just playing. They were conducting the global energy of relief, turning the same ley lines that had once carried distress into a highway of pure, unadulterated celebration. Elian felt it as a golden tide rising around his ankles, a warmth that didn't just heat the skin, but ignited the spirit. Kalen laughed, and the sound triggered a cascade of crystalline chimes from the surrounding flora. "I can feel them," he shouted over the humming wind. "The people, they aren't just awake, they're dancing, all of them. It's as if the whole world just remembered a song it had forgotten how to sing." He looked at Elian, and for the first time, the scientific distance in his eyes had been entirely replaced by a luminous, childlike wonder. The man who had once held the obsidian spire stood among them, his weathered face softened by a smile that seemed to erase centuries of bitterness. He didn't join the dance with the vigor of the children, but he leaned back against a quartz pillar, his presence now a grounding bass note to the high-frequency joy of the crowd. "The dissonance was a heavy cloak to wear," he murmured, his voice vibrating with a quiet, profound peace. "To see them cast it off, it is the only victory that ever truly mattered." As the sun dipped below the horizon, the indigo sky didn't darken. Instead, it ignited into a shimmering aurora of gold and violet, a celestial canopy that mirrored the festive lights of the cities appearing as tiny, twinkling diamonds across the globe. The high priest of the bass note expanded his form, his plasma nebula swirling into a great, protective dome over the plateau. "The circuit is closed," the entity resonated, the sound like a warm, enveloping blanket of light. "The celebration is the seal. By choosing joy over the memory of pain, you have anchored the Atlas to the earth not with gravity, but with love."